You need to have actually deliver foundational knowledge. It can't just be, I would like to learn about X, I don't want to know about Y. It's like, well, no, you need to know about Y, otherwise that bridge might fall into the water.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is a friend of mine, Mark Sollis. You might remember him from a previous episode of this podcast where we talked about the book Thank You for Being Late by Thomas Friedman. And many of the ideas and the themes in that conversation, which was episode number 60, do come in hand in this conversation about higher education. Mark Sollis is an expert in strategy, in communication, when it comes to higher education, and our conversation about it is really fascinating. We talk about disruption in that field, especially when it comes to technology and the digital sphere and how that is transforming and revolutionizing education. We talk about this mentality that it's always been done a certain way and how we can overcome that. Global forces at play and how education allows us to understand those forces. The idea that new universities are going to be kaleidoscopes of learning, how they can be networked together and form different kinds of educational opportunities rather than the ones that we're used to. We talked about the question of purpose, which is maybe the main theme of this conversation. What are universities and higher educational institutions meant to do? What are they for? Now, if you like this podcast, please give it a review and a rating on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use, and go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes as well as all future ones. You can find ways to get in touch with me to let me know what you think of this episode or any other, and give me your suggestions for future guests and future topics to be discussed on this podcast. I really do look forward to hearing from you. Mark Sollis, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks for me again.
Well, thank you for coming again.
Other side of the country, but away we go.
Yeah, we're in Calgary. You have a beautiful view where we are, looking out at the Peace Bridge. I'm really excited to chat with you about higher education, which is the field that you work in. You're actually, you own a company called D3 Advancement and Communication Strategies. Is that right?
Close. Advancement Strategies and Communications.
Oh, I was so close. Why D3?
It's a personal connection, actually. D3 it stands for to dream, to dare, to do. So a very one of the things, and some of you may recognize a sports reference in there. I'll leave that for others to go for. But for me, I've been thinking about this for quite a long time. Since I really started taking on leadership roles in higher education, and always knew that I wanted to be in this space, and that for me, this is about pushing people, including myself, past what they would see day to day, past some of what may be comfortable to think about, to really, and so for me, advancement has been the specialty, advancement being the external relations type functions, has been the specialty within higher ed that I've chosen. And it's pushing past what everyone else is doing and what is normal and saying, okay, what's next? What's next? And so that's the dreaming piece. The daring is, of course, having the courage to do. And that in itself is not enough. You actually have to then find a way to execute and deliver. And so the alliteration of the to dream, to dare, to do is very purposeful, and that itself is D3.
And there's a reference in there that's always at the signature of your emails to a George Bernard Shaw quote, paraphrased by Robert Kennedy. Mm-hmm. Do you know it off by heart?
Not off by heart.
I got it if you don't.
I know it because I chose that one very purposefully as well.
There are those that look at things the way they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not. Mm-hmm. I love that.
Yeah, me too. And so that's there. It's not going anywhere. It's going to be there till this exercise or enterprise is kind of found its natural course. And I would say you could ask many of the people I've worked for over the years, and this would be one of probably hopefully a positive contribution to the groups and teams I'm a part of. Also a challenge, right? Because I'm not somebody who necessarily accepts willingly the current practice. I do want to unpack it and understand and then put it in its current context or future context and say, is there something we might do differently? So that idea of there's something and looking at why not? Why can't we do something else? Why couldn't we do something different? Is in the famous committee kind of cliche of we've always done it this way. I've worked with so many people over the years who reference that, know that it is one of the most alarming statements that is ever made in a committee, and yet I've been in meetings with these very same individuals who will get trapped by the power of that statement, right? Because it becomes, okay, well, we just, let's get on to the next thing.
Right.
That may be, given all sorts of choices on resource and people, the right thing to do. There are management challenges and leadership challenges. However, in my experience, too often it's just that's the easiest thing to do.
Well, and it's also the definition of insanity,
Yeah.
doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Yeah.
And if you have a committee meeting and saying, we need to achieve better results this year, well, we'll just keep trying to do what we've been
Yes.
doing.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of a conversation that you and I had, obviously not on the podcast, about a potential fourth D.
Yes.
The D of disruption, which
Yes.
is what you, I think, do so well, whether it's in the higher education field, the political field, wherever we're going to look. Disruption is almost your middle name.
Thanks. Yeah, again, probably some people view that positively and others less so, most certainly less so.
Well, we live in a world of disruption.
We do.
And flux. And so I would have to see that maybe 50 years ago, it would have been more negative for people. But I can't avoid seeing that as a positive today, because that's the world we live in.
Yeah. So you're right to raise disruption. And in fact, disruption is going to slide in there. It's always going to be D3. There's a historical kind of connectivity to me in that I want to keep. But in fact, I've been working on this fourth D, this disruption piece. And so let's not call it positive and let's not call it negative. Let's call it is, right? So I think your point is well taken. For me, thinking about disruption in higher ed or in the space, we talked about the political world, you and I have done some work there together, or being disruptive as an individual, as a practitioner, it just is, right? It's something I've become comfortable with. It's not something I seek. It's not something I see as this is positive, and therefore those who are not, they by definition would be negative. It just is. This is how I start to operate in the world. And so when I'm in a space, when I'm thinking about higher ed, when I'm thinking about the world around me and what might come, this disruption piece is, this might be slightly different next year. And I think, quite frankly, there's some very good reasons why it might be different in 10 years, and we can chat about those in a bit. So yeah, disruption is sliding in there, and it's becoming, it is a part of who I am. It is a state of how I think.
It's almost a temperament.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really good way to look at it, because there are so many times where an organization needs a disruptor to come in, but there are also times where we need a steady hand to keep things going just the way they were. And, if we take the Myers-Briggs personality test of the 4 temperaments, really, we could say, well, sometimes an organization needs a rational thinker who can design a whole new system, and sometimes we need someone to implement what someone else put together, because sometimes that person that's going to design the system can't really follow it through, doesn't have the temperament to do so. And it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It means that we should have some kind of balance between them. But I wanted to give you the chance, as I give every guest the chance to do, which is to answer the question, the big question of the show, which is deliberately broad for a deliberately broad response. So, Mark, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, and I'm going to take the question and put it back to education. And if you don't mind, I'm going to actually refer back to the first conversation we had, because that actually is a pretty important conversation for me. And we're talking about these themes of digitalization. We're talking about the global connectivity, and we're talking about the environment. And he's got some terminology around that. But for me, what's going on in higher education, what's going on in education generally, is a response to, or should be a response to, those 3 forces, and some others as well. But for me, this is a really important time. We have an opportunity within higher ed, which is where I've been spending my time. I can talk about education generally as well. We have an opportunity within education to leverage some forces at play that I think can be a very positive contribution. Some are doing so. Undoubtedly, there's some great work happening locally, regionally, globally. I think there are some opportunities still to be had there. I also think there's some challenges. I think that we can have to think about, as we had in our first conversation, think about, this isn't all positive. This is right.
This is what it is.
And so, but it's the acceleration piece, the fact that it's coming at us so fast. And so what does that mean in a space of education where you're trying to teach somebody knowledge? You're trying to have them acquire knowledge, and yet that knowledge is constantly changing. And so how do you do that in a system that has a chronology to it? 16 years, you get your bachelor degree. tend to think in terms of K to 16 now. There's some jurisdictions that even use that language, getting through that first kind of post-secondary piece. That's a long time in a world that's in some of those industries that are changing every 4 or 5 years.
Well, it's interesting because disruption is hitting higher education in a way more strongly than other fields. And it's disruption from technology, it's disruption from decreasing enrollment, but also really, really increasing tuition costs, which is part and parcel with growing inequality. Going back to our conversation about thank you for being late. There are only so many who can afford to go to school now. And in terms of the Canadian dream or the American dream, where we have equality of opportunity, that's impossible if only those of means can go to school or those who happen to have the luck of getting a scholarship. I mean, I know that there are other challenges, but what do you think of the challenges that I just mentioned or the disruptions that are facing higher education?
I'm going to take two of the forces and put them together because I think this is the tuition one's really interesting. But for me, and I do have this conversation very, very, very often with colleagues. It as you know,
please tell me I'm wrong.
No,
because you were making a stern face as I was saying that, and I was thinking, am I off the wrong course here?
Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's a very North American centric viewpoint,
right?
And you could argue it's common to some others, and it is to some others as well, but. So these two forces. So you've got you're talking about economic disruption and forces and tuition going up, and we all know that, and we can have our viewpoints on that. But in fact, in an education system which is increasingly globally connected, the public policy decisions of other jurisdictions have massive impact on what we're doing in higher education, and that for me is a fascinating space for us to explore, and one that is we're not having the conversation around that we should be. So. We know we've got two very, very large countries doing some remarkable work in higher education. I mean, when I say large, 1.5 billion each, doing some remarkable work in higher education. We have a whole region of the world. Their policies around things like tuition, the way they have thought about higher education, it is different than the way we've thought about higher education. There's commonality for sure, and there's certainly the around knowledge, and I'm not an academic. But if you think about some of the policy decisions or the way they go about their business, those are different. And that's the world we're competing in. So we can say all day long that we would like international students from country X, and that we require that. They have international tuition rates, we have our domestic tuition rates, differentials even in Canada. But when a decision is made by a large jurisdiction to build lots of very wonderful, successful universities and decide that we would like to actually have our students educated here, and by the way, public policy is such that there the tuition rates are nil. I last worked in a country where domestic tuition was zero. Right? That would be unheard of here, and I don't even know you could get that conversation started in Canada.
Or at least outside of Quebec.
Outside of Quebec, even they don't have zero tuition, though.
But that's part of the conversation there.
Yeah, that's true. They have zero tuition for domestic students. They have there's nuances within that. But so the reason I was making the face when you were saying that is because I think, here in Canada we tend to, and I worked in the field long enough in Canada to have many, many people reference America. Well, at least we don't pay American rates. You're right, but we don't pay Scottish rates either, and we don't pay French, and we don't pay German, we don't pay X.
And we don't pay the rates we used to pay.
That's right. And so that to me is, we can look to one, or we can look at a global higher education community and say, what's happening elsewhere? And in this huge tapestry of higher education, what's happening in terms of universities that are becoming excellent in jurisdictions that perhaps historically may not have been investing or didn't have that opportunity. What's happening in terms of public policy decisions? What's happening in some of the areas that might affect the areas you're interested in, access to people going to school? I think that's some of the conversation we need to be having more so than we are. And not just, by the way, within executive suites with universities. I do know what happens there. I've been in one and a few of them. But it needs to happen regularly. We need to be thinking about higher ed that way. And so there's one example of maybe pushing on the education system to say it's not enough just to know what's happening here in Calgary or in Alberta or in Canada. We have to really be thinking within the global context. That's where I like tying some of the themes of the conversation we had earlier now back to education. So I'm using some of Friedman and others in my thinking. Okay, so all of these things I've experienced the last 20 years working in higher education. How does that now play? What holds? What doesn't hold? What has changed so significantly that we need to be having the conversation? I'm most interested myself in the space of digital the impact, the positive impact that the new digital world can have in the space of education, particularly around access, and particularly I did a stint of my life up in Northern Canada, way up in Northern Canada, and how that might help that community have equitable access.
I think access is a hugely important word, especially for this podcast, or at least my thinking about democracy, because, Western democracies have grown in lockstep with strong education systems. And in fact, it's kind of impossible to imagine a modern democracy existing without A, a free press, B, an education system, C, trust in government, trust in institutions that are running the affairs of state, but also the affairs of business, everything that's around us. And what's interesting about this question about access is it ties to every other element, whether it's cost or technology, innovation, how a university is conceived and built, and who it serves. And I'm wondering if there's a place in the world that is really, really exciting for you, or a region, a city, a university that is doing something different, whether you agree with it or not, and is exciting you, and why.
Pick that one single,
or three, or five, or what's the top of your mind?
Yeah, I think I'm not gonna answer that question.
Okay.
I'm gonna tell you why, because I think it would be unfair to then the 10 more that I would think about the second we take the headsets off.
Okay.
And here's, because I think I could just, right here in Calgary, I have an affiliation. I've worked at 3 of the institutions here in Calgary. I'm a graduate of one. I have a fondness for most of the, and the reason I wouldn't have a fondness for them because I don't know it, but I haven't worked at ACAD. I love what ACAD contributes, sort of ACAD's new name. I just got back, and so I'm a bit out of date there. Bow Valley's contribution, remarkable to the community. We have here in Calgary already some amazing institutions contributing what I would think are novel and, in their own way, disruptive contributions to an ecosystem of higher education.
Okay, so let me rephrase the question. Instead of who out there is doing something exciting, what out there is exciting to you? What out there is pushing the boundaries? What out there is redefining or completely revolutionizing what education and higher education is? You don't have to give me examples, but yeah.
And that's where I wanted to go. So
okay.
I think that, to me, is a much more comfortable question. So when I look at the institutions that I get exposed to, either through work or where I'm off doing a contract or I'm reading about them, and these do have some local examples that people can choose to follow up on, where institutions are making deliberate attempts to expand people's understanding around culture, whether it be local, divergent cultures locally, or culture globally. And we're going to talk about one of the things I think is most important around access. It is incredibly important that people understand the global world in which they live. We talked about the acceleration of global connectivity. It is not enough to know Calgary. It's not enough to know within your field what's happening in nursing or business or journalism, which was my degree, local. You have to understand the global context from my perspective. And so that's what one of these forces that is driving higher education to say, hang on a second. And I know, again, I can reference some of the places I've been where student mobility, not just students coming here, students going elsewhere to get a better sense and being on the ground, or integrating that into the curriculum, or weaving in whatever way you can to expand people's understanding of the culture beyond their own. That, to me, anyone doing work in that space, I'm interested. And I'm constantly, whenever I go to a new institution, I get the good fortune of doing that quite regularly. Some of the first things I'm looking for. What are you doing with your local communities that may be Indigenous? What are you doing internationally? I'm always excited about what I hear in the international space. Do I think we're doing enough? No, I don't. And that's not because I think schools are making efforts. I just think we should do more and more of this. And part of the reason I think we should do more of it is because that's the world we're living in. And I listen to enough of your shows to understand the consequences of when we don't do that. We get some very, very, very poor public policy decisions and public policy support and leaders, because we are trying to say, oh, that is really uncomfortable, this big global space and everything's moving around me. Let's get back to, we got to work locally. We got to make sure we get local. And I'm not disagreeing with that piece of it, saying, but that's local within a global context. You can't ignore the global context. And
right.
So that to me is space where, both in higher ed, and I hope increasingly more in the K-12 system, and I see that my son's sister actually is doing, it just happened last night. I was coming home from the airport, and this popped up. She's off to London doing something as part of her education system in the K-12 system, going overseas for international. That's great. We need more of that. It's that exposure piece.
Right. And I think another word for this could be constituency, maybe.
Yes.
The constituency of a university, the champions of a university, the community that a university both builds but is also based on.
Yeah.
I read a report by Grant Thornton, the State of Higher Education from 2019. It was the 8th annual report they've done on this. And one thing that they essentially argue, or the main argument really of the piece is that the traditional brick and mortar per city university is going the way of the dodo bird, and it will be replaced by a national university, which is essentially a chain of colleges that are both physical and digital, and that this is the only way forward because students are going to be looking for to get their credits in university from different places. So I'm going to go and do one course here in Calgary, but then I'm going to do an online course through Beijing, and then I'm going to do a couple months in Australia, and I insist that it all be taken at the same level and add up to my education. It's kind of similar to how a lot of proponents of a decentralized pension plan are arguing for, that your pension should be topped up by whatever employer you have, but the same pension rather than a different one housed at a different employer. Forbes magazine argued against this, and they said one of the reasons why this will not happen is because the core constituency of a university as it exists today is too strong, too powerful, and will resist this change. Now that seems to me a fair argument, but I don't think it'll stop the change if the change is coming. It'll simply postpone it. But what do you take of both the state of the state of higher education report, but also this argument against it based on constituency?
Yeah. I saw the Grant Thornton piece, read it. I think it puts it out there. I mean, it certainly throws, the disruptive kind of hypothesis statement out there or thesis statement out there. No, I don't think that's where we're headed. I think elements we're definitely headed towards. And so...
So why are we not headed that way?
I think we are headed that way, but I don't think that removes traditional university structures and campuses. I don't think it removes the notion that people want to come together a period of time of their life to not only learn, but to actually become part of social groups. I believe that will still be here. What I will say, and the reason I read the study and many others like this, I think elements of what they're talking about and more of that, I think we're going to see more of that. And I think so my personal take on reading pieces like that or working in higher ed, I think, and we've already seen an increased presence of digital education, right? So somebody not having to come to a physical campus to actually take learning. And this isn't old school correspondence style. This is proper, you're getting into conversations with groups through all sorts of media available today that just weren't available 30 years ago. And myself included, I went through schooling where my groups were based all over the world. But I think we're seeing more and more of that, especially as technology becomes part of the piece. I think that to me is almost here, and I think we'll just continue to grow. One of the things I do think we see early stages of what I do believe will be quite a bit different than in let's say a decade from now, and I'm just picking that timeline. Two things related. One is that people will acquire knowledge, and therefore the accreditation comes with it, perhaps not through a very traditional kind of, I went to one school, I got a degree from University of X or College Y, but that it might be. And you see some partnerships, of course, now, and you see people getting dual degrees, but you actually might see a much more even fragmented model than that. Just like and that's just that's not just my thing, and that's obviously what they're saying as well, is it might just be as the system. I need to acquire learning in a tech piece and an engineering piece and some business, and that's going to come from lots of places, and that itself is going to become a credential. And there's an introduction now of some private players in here, businesses saying, we're just going to support the acquiring of knowledge, and we'll brand it and give it a credential, and that'll be what you need. That would be one piece. So, or multiple credentials from multiple institutions. Like I think you could end up. So I as some people know, have worked in the space of alumni engagement, alumni relations for a long time. And one of the things I'm comfortable saying to some of my colleagues is I do try to imagine a state where our alumnus and our alumna and all of the things we want he or she to contribute to a university, where that person's loyalty won't be just split between maybe their bachelor degree and their master's degree, their postgraduate, et cetera, but they might be graduating from 8 institutions at once because of this kind of new model.
Sounds like a modular form of education.
Very much a modular form. I can imagine, just from my perspective, and it's not something I go and would advocate an institution, but from my perspective, I can imagine a space where we get there. Right? That because of other things I see, because of what I know is happening with some of the companies providing education, because you can see where that might become driven by the learner, driven by the need, something that they want. They're going to need to acquire some piece of knowledge that wasn't available when they were in education. I think we'll start there. They're going to have to come back and get it. And they don't want to do a formal credential just to get that one new element. But there might be elements where you look at, I want excellence from this local university and that regional college. And by the way, that university that's over in Asia Pacific, I'd like to take that and make that part of my knowledge base rather than say, you, institution X, have everything I need within that one institution. That I want to kind of spread myself out. And that's what digital and this global connectivity opportunity is there for us. So to me, that seems something that we should at least be discussing.
Well, and it sounds to me like it could eventually be good for the university because it will allow them to focus on what they're good at. So instead of a university having to provide everything, they can provide what they know they're going to be sought after for. So, for example, the University of Saskatchewan has always been known for agriculture and horticulture. Well, what if it was allowed to focus almost entirely on that? It could be even better at that. It's almost in the same way what proponents of free trade say, is that a country shouldn't have to produce everything for its citizens. By engaging in free trade, the country that can produce, say, soybeans the easiest should produce all the soybeans, so that another country that produces wheat can focus more on wheat. And I mean, this is a very simplistic analogy here, but maybe universities could benefit from this by being able to focus more clearly. Or do you think that's getting away from this idea of a university, an idea of a universal institution?
Yeah, I can hear the very first president I worked for back in my days at Mount Royal bristling at what you just said, and I would share that. I from my perspective, we don't want to go there. We don't want. Because of the other pieces of social cohesion and community and understanding, and in fact, I would go the other way. I think we, regardless of our area of interest and our specialty, should have more knowledge of other parts of the knowledge sphere, some of the spaces around us. Right? I've never. When I was a university student, I always used to, I don't know, just get uncomfortable when people say, "Oh, well, you're the English students, you don't need to know math." Of course you do, right? And that was, that's a cliche, but that's what basically we're hearing across the board. No, I don't think we should go there. What I would say, it would allow entities to deliver their expertise, and that could be a university could have expertise in Russian studies, in agriculture, and nuclear science, but within the context of where they are geographically, within the context of where they are in terms of public policy, and connect that to another part of the globe that has a different local context and a different public policy context. So it might be, and I'm interested in communications, and that was my field, study it. Yeah, I want to take the best of what we have to do from practitioners and experts, academic experts here in Calgary, and in this where we are. But I would like to understand what practicing journalism looks like in a country that doesn't have a liberal democracy. I'd like to actually understand, and not just from a perspective of somebody who's educated in and practice the profession in a liberal democracy. I want to actually learn it from somebody who's practiced it in, say, China.
To get in the bubble.
Yeah. And so that's where I think we could, so rather than saying, no, we're going to, university, you'll see that I don't use names very often because I don't want to offend any one of my colleagues.
I'll do it.
Yeah, you can, right? But I say University X, rather than focusing on something that might be, I can look out the doors and see the product of that. And, we can talk about Alberta Energy. No, let's not do that. What we can do, though, is say it's important in these fields to actually understand what's happening globally. And again, I want to be clear. I know of, even in this city, there are practices like that now. I just don't think there's enough of them. And I think we need to, that's the disruption. So it's not about, that's why I don't agree with the Grant Thornton piece. No, I think campuses will exist. Do I think all the campuses will exist? No, I don't. I think that will change. I think we'll see different types of them. I think we're going to see digital campuses. I think we're going to see more of that. But it's going to be, this buffet of educational opportunities. And some are going to work for some learners. Some will work for others. Some will have longstanding histories that will be almost impossible to change, and they don't want to change. Those institutions don't want to change. Some will say, "I'm ready. This is great. This is new space for us." We've almost. I was working or meeting with a vice chancellor in Australia about 2 months ago, and we were having a conversation about her university and where she was thinking what she was going to do with that university, particularly around the constituents, the external relations part of her world. And what would have been historically might have maybe been a challenge in that a lot of the learners there for them were distance learners or part-time learners, because that was the local space they were in, where they were situated in Australia. I flipped it and said, I think you've got a great opportunity now, because if you're looking at learners needing to reacquire knowledge on a regular basis, or acquire new knowledge on a regular basis, you're looking at people who need different types of learning opportunities. They already see you as an institution that has that cultural understanding in terms of delivering education like that, and that awareness, that interest, versus another institution who might have been very traditional 4-year or 4+2 kind of institution. I said, this is great for you, right? So yeah, I think we can end up in a really interesting place. The other part of the Grant Thornton bit is that let's not move to a national university and we're trying to fit all these pieces in. That loses some really rich cultural elements that each institution bring to the table. Part of when we're working, you choose an institution that you feel like those shoes fit, right? And it's not just because they're doing excellent work; it's because culturally you like the place. But we could be doing a lot more, I would suggest, in terms of thinking about the ecosystem of higher education and saying, well, how do we all play together? Let's not set up competitive models within a space, which quite frankly is a public good. Let's set up some much more collaboration. Again, I can almost hear my colleagues saying, well, we do that. We do, but can we do more of it?
Can we do more? Are we doing enough?
And should we be doing more nationally? And yes, we should.
One thing that Mark said that I wanted to bring up again is this idea that universities are trying to expand people's understanding of culture, local and broad ideas of culture, and how it's important that people understand the global world in which they live, the connected world in which they live, and perhaps it's only higher education that can do that. Coming up in this conversation, Mark does challenge me on a few ideas, and this is what I appreciate the most about him and having this kind of conversation with Mark. He's not going to let me off the hook if I say something a little bit lazy or without thinking. That's coming up in this episode of What on Earth is Going On. Well, it's an interesting question because another lens to put on this is, to what extent can universities and higher education and colleges, if we're going to call them that, be seen as student-centric? So obviously the Grant Thornton piece, but other pieces and articles as well talk about how education needs to become more student-centric in order to cater to the demands of the digital native today. And so Amazon is a good example of a company that was able to use the internet and use an incredible system of logistics to make the customer the center of the transaction. So I can get whatever I want from wherever I want without friction, using a simple device that I can hold in my hand. And Amazon is spending probably more time on one thing than any other. And that thing is to make it easier for you to spend your money. Obviously, that's what any business should be engaged in. Now, seeing this same thing through the lens of higher education, to make the student the center of the dynamic, what could that mean? Could that revolutionize universities, or are universities already placing the student at the center? I mean, in this conversation that we're having right now, we're talking about these incredible institutions, and I agree. When I went to school, it was extremely important for me to learn that math and science and theater and different books I was reading were linked, even if I couldn't see immediately and apparently why. And it belies the point about the university being a universal institution. But is the pressure of being student-centric going to fragment that even just a little bit? Or are we going to see a new paradigm where they remain universal but are also putting the student at the center of all discourse?
That is a very, very big question. And when I say big question, I mean it's a conversation that's happening, and I've had it I think thousands of times over the last 20 years. Let's just pull apart a couple pieces. One, student-centric. So the notion of the student being the center of all activity at a university is and you used Amazon, a great example, by the way, so it's not a consumer good, and I think that is one of the challenges. that we have, again, coming from a North American standpoint.
And a market-based standpoint.
Yeah, I'm paying for something, therefore I want something
Give
back.
me my good. Yeah.
And I argued back when I was a student leader, which I was years ago, that was actually likely to be one of the outcomes of this, at that time, dramatically increased tuition. I did say to a few of the university presidents at one time, you wait. You're going to start to hear language that you're not going to want to hear from students that is very consumer-like, right? Because we've now moved to the space, and you actually have some examples in the U.S. already where there's lawsuits and guaranteed outcomes in one of the states. One of the states is talking about guaranteed outcomes, and if not, you get refunds and all sorts of stuff.
Really? Like, you mean you sign up to do a degree and they guarantee you'll get
a job, and so jurisdictions are having these conversations now about, because it's a market-based model. Let's go back. Let's say, okay, well, the center of an institution, if we're dealing with university or college X, is learning, right? It should be learning-centric. And learning-centric means you need to have research. Learning-centric means you need to make sure the student is actually acquiring knowledge and is able to push, not just sit there. I'm a bit older than you. I actually remember going to university class where it was the transparencies on an overhead, and you could see that they were.
Oh yeah, no, I had that.
Okay, so dated. That's not learning either.
I had chalkboards, and no, there were not, like, one person in the class might have had a laptop when I was in university.
Well, I'm thinking more where the transparencies had clearly not been updated for 10 years.
Right.
And so that there's not learning happening there. I would argue that's not learning, and thankfully that now is again a cliche that most students, I think, aren't going through that. Learning-centric means you have all sorts of activity happening that supports us becoming more knowledgeable as an individual and as a society. You need to have research. You need to have academic spending space. You need to have actually deliver foundational knowledge. It can't just be, I would like to learn about X, I don't want to know about Y. It's like, well, no, you need to know about Y, otherwise that bridge might fall into the water. Or you need to know, so again, back to my own practice, you as a journalism graduate need to understand some things about economic and business theory, because you're going to be asked to cover stories on this, and you can't just talk about poor journalism where someone has no knowledge. You can tell, right? All they've done is actually gone out and tried to get some quotes and feed something that's grammatically coherent, right? And that's it. But there's nothing really rich there. And you can see brilliant journalists where they actually have expanded their minds. Well, when we talked about Friedman, obviously being one of them, he's a journalist, but he studies all these fields. No, I think that it's about being learning-centric, which, again, many of the institutions are, and certainly many would proclaim to be and want to be and are, and I think that's where we need to be. So that doesn't mean that we do exactly what we're doing today. It means there's constant pressures, constant accelerations, we go back to the acceleration language, of other forces around us, and therefore we constantly have to adapt the learning environment, because there are needs of learners that may not be something that's readily apparent to somebody who has become an academic or a specialist at a certain period of time. And I'm going to go back to global connectivity. There are changes happening constantly in the world of which we want our learners, whether they're graduate students or undergraduates, to continue to not only know, but then seek, because it's constantly moving. So that's where this student-centric piece could kind of fall off the rails, but the intention is good.
But I'm really glad you positioned it this way, because you're actually going, I mean, it sounds wonderful, student-centric, but if we're looking at it from a market-based approach, then it's just so obvious what we're doing. We're saying it's okay for a person, and this sounds great, it's okay for a person to go onto their phone or their computer and say, I want the following 7 skills. Give me them, and give me a certificate that says that I have them, and I can have these 4 from this institution, these 3 from that, and all good in the end, and then I'll get a job. Well, is that person actually going to be prepared to do the job that they're going for? Which is one criticism of, and one challenge that modern universities are facing, is that a lot of students seem unprepared when they actually leave university, and a lot of parents who sent them there are wondering, well, why did I even do it? And the other way to look at it too that I've read about is that universities are becoming experience-centric. They're selling the experience of campus life in order to compete with other universities. And so whether it's a guaranteed outcome of what you're going to get when you finish, you're definitely going to get a good time in your water park that's next to your dorm room at a university, because a university needs to say, well, we offer this that nothing else can do. And parents are seeking an experience for their kids, because for them, it was the time of their lives. And so does experience, I mean, maybe we're just getting into semantics here, but experience-centric, consumer-centric, student-centric. I mean, professor-centric is the way that the medieval university was founded. It was all centered around the professor and making sure that they could have their legacy continue and make money off of their knowledge.
Here I want to pick up on three things. Two you said, and one I wanted, which is actually happening in our public policy conversation right now. So two. One, I think that's lazy on behalf of people who say statements like, I send my students to university, and employers come back and say, these kids aren't prepared. I'm in roundtables all the time, and I hear that from people in my age group. No. Are there some learners who come out who are not prepared? Yes. Was that ever thus? Yes. Right.
So it hasn't gotten worse.
How would we know? I mean, other than somebody's anecdotal experience of these students aren't prepared like they were when I graduated. That's like people saying, back in my day, we were polite and kind, and now we're not. And in fact, you need to look around the world and see what the youth of the world are doing right now to tackle some fairly big things. In Alberta, there's something happening right now, and we know where it's being driven by youth with an incredible moral compass and a sense of fairness and kind. So no, I think that's fairly lazy, and I think we need to be careful about that. Do I think some learners come out that are not prepared? Yes, but that was the case. Some workers come in, they're not prepared. It's just life, and that's our job, is to help people become prepared. And I think some come out and are absolutely brilliant and ready to push boundaries, and that might be uncomfortable for the person they're working for, so they say, oh, Mary's not ready. Why? Well, because Mary doesn't do it the way I do it. Well, it's because Mary is actually really pushing past the way that's been done for 30 years. So I think that's a dangerous statement. The other I want to pick up on is that notion of campus experiences, and we're competing. You can be sure that coming to an institution of higher learning, a college, a university, a technical institute, is a full-rounded experience, right? It should be. It's where you meet friends. It's where you start to grow, not just as a youth. If you go back as an older student, it's part of an experience. I don't believe people are making decisions solely based on that. And other than some very weird kind of examples that are in the media, unfortunately, most people are choosing to go to learn, and they also want those experiential pieces. And while I think campuses are absolutely and rightly spending time thinking about the full breadth of the experience they're delivering a student, that's becoming, again, learning centric. I want to know that not only what happened in the classroom, what's happening in the co-curricular space. How can we get people interested in the world around them, in hobbies, in conversations of political discourse? Those are part of a campus experience. And some of that includes social space. Yeah, these are,
for sure,
this is great. This is what we want campuses to do. And so it may manifest as competitive language, but in fact, it's campuses addressing that this is a small community that has lots of things going on, and we want that to happen in a space where people can learn and grow together. So those are the two. Here's where the one you didn't reference, and I think we need to, is in at least a couple of provinces right now, the public policy of we're going to hold these pieces to these institutions to account for delivering graduates ready to work. This is the whole notion of that's in. Again, I'm not suggesting that employability is not an important feature of higher education institutions. And I would say I've not ever worked at one, nor have I run across one, so that doesn't matter at all. I just haven't seen those. I don't know where that comes from, that mythology comes from, because it just doesn't exist. People are very well aware of the movement of most learners, traditional learners, through an undergraduate experience into some form of work. And I would say learners now continuing, going back and continuing, that's connected to employment as much as it is their enrichment of their lives through wanting to know more. But when you start to get into, I think they're feeding off a mythology that we actually are not spending time on this space in higher ed, thinking about the connection to employment in the successful economy. And it's almost like, well, they're there to make sure that we have a successful economy. Well, they're contributing to it for sure, but they're not wholly accountable for this deliverable. And you live in one and I live in the other, where I think there's some rhetoric right now where I would probably say, let's soften that a bit. And first off, let's have a better understanding of what's actually happening, right, in our campuses. Is everything perfect? No. And we started the conversation with, I think we should disrupt a little bit more. I think we should be looking more global context. I think we should be, I do agree that some of the higher education experiences are likely to be more of a kaleidoscope of experiences. You might have the traditional to this very kind of diverse, studying globally, kind of micro-credential kind of experience. but that all fits into the system. That's a good thing. We don't want to just take this and then shift it and make it one other thing. We actually want to make sure we continue to expand the boundaries. But in higher education, these conversations are happening. Maybe not as quickly as they should at all places. Maybe there's some organizational barriers to really taking that step forward in some cases. But let's not then throw everything, the good stuff that's happening and the good out to get to the space we need to be in 10 years. That would be also a very challenging. This is going very differently, by the way, than I thought it might go when we started.
Good. That's probably the best compliment I could get.
I'm now. I find myself defending higher education.
Well, in the research that I did, what I discovered in leading up to this conversation was that higher education is a hot topic right now. And it's a hot topic for several reasons, but one of them is, of course, it's being disrupted as a space, and we don't know where it's going. But in a few books that have been written over the past couple of years, the key question that universities and higher education faces that other things don't face is the question of purpose. So we know what an electricity company does. We know what a warehouse company does. We know what Walmart does. What's being revolutionized is how they do it. What Amazon is doing is not revolutionizing what I want, although that may eventually happen. It's revolutionizing how I get it. The problem with universities and higher education and the stuff that I've read is a question of so-called teleology or purpose. What is the purpose of a university? What is the utility of it? There are many different answers to this question. There are many people out there who would say, and these are the people you're talking about in Alberta or Ontario who are talking about public policy solutions to make sure that universities provide a route from high school to employability. Obviously, someone like me and you who have maybe a liberal arts background, or at least privilege learning about civics above other things, would say, well, no, a university prepares people for living, period. Or at least it prepares people for living in a democracy, or living more fully, or living a more examined life, to use Socrates' quote. But there's other utilities that universities provide too. They obviously provide the utility of bringing a city or a province or a country or a world together. There are conversations that happen on universities that don't happen anywhere else in the world. And if they weren't for universities, we wouldn't be having them. They're the frontiers of knowledge, of research. They're pushing forward the human species into space and into science in ways that could not be possible otherwise. But they're also, we can have a research lab that is studying cosmology, but a university is there to link that research lab to someone who's studying Shakespeare and to make a more full human experience. That's my perspective of what a university, or what at least learning, can offer. But the question there is under debate. And I think that this is what's really key and critical to me, is this question of purpose. What is the utility of a university? And I guess maybe I just answered it for myself. For you, what's the utility or the purpose of a university?
As you were speaking, I was thinking of it. So through the various generations of myself, of my work or experience in student services, over to advancement in even in finance and that side of the world for a while, I've always believed the purpose of higher education is about knowledge. And so I like the word knowledge, and I think it may be easy to go there, but it's because I don't believe that higher education institutions, universities certainly have exclusive domain over knowledge creation, over the exploration of knowledge, over the conversation on knowledge. But one could put forward that it is a space that is their primary purpose, unlike any other. So knowledge might be explored by a private company, but they're also making money. They've got shareholders, et cetera, et cetera.
It can never be their full purpose.
Yeah, exactly. But it's still, and I think this is really important, there's still phenomenal knowledge acquisition and knowledge exploration happening in those spaces, and we want that too. So that's the other. We don't want to go backwards. We want Silicon Valley exploring things in some of the spaces they are, because they're doing phenomenal work. We want that connected, though, to, but they're also, many of them, they're private companies making money and making people money, and they've got other forces and other demands. For me, higher education is about knowledge. It's about the sharing of knowledge. It's about the transfer of knowledge between people who have had the experiences before and therefore are able to facilitate knowledge, because some of the knowledge they may not even have themselves, but they're facilitating the ability to acquire knowledge. You're talking about knowledge. You're talking about collaboration. You're talking about exploring spaces, new research in all sorts of domain. that's, to me, and this is just Mark, casual layperson, happened to have worked in higher ed for 20 years. But when and this is from working in colleges to working in major research institutions to a university that was very local market connected. So it was very driven by this idea of employability in professions. And I was always looking for the common ground between all of them. And it was, we're supporting this space around knowledge, and I can serve all of them equally with the same passion, because I think this is exactly what their purpose is to be in this space. And each of them take a different take on that. Each of them might specialize in that space because of their part of the ecosystem, because of what the needs of that local environment are. You could be working in a developing nation versus working in one of the G7. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons. But the common element to me is around knowledge, versus they are about getting people jobs. That language, by the way, I think is some of the most terrifying language that's out there.
But the unfortunate part is that for many people, many of whom don't have an education, your answer makes less sense than it gives people jobs. It gives people the skills to have jobs.
But agreed. Here's the piece, though. And again, I've had this debate on probably too many coffee shop chairs and too many bar stools, but that doesn't exclude the fact that people then go to a university or a college or a TI or to get the knowledge to have a job, to become employable, in fact, it enables that. It's part of that system. And so that's where you have something. You have this wonderful collection of institutions and potential institutions. You got this space, and it can work together in a system very well. It can serve research space. It can serve a local economy. It can serve the needs of learners as both learning to become part of a civil society, but also learners as, I need to get a job because I need to buy a car and eat and fly and go to Maui for vacation. All these things that you want. It can actually do that. And one could argue it's been doing that, right? Are there parts of it that need to be refined and become more flexible and become, we need to adapt to society like anything else, right? Yes. But we shouldn't. That means go, okay, well, let's cut off those arms, or let's get so solely focused on that one piece of it that we lose some of the other elements in university. Again, this has gone a very different way than I thought it might. But for me, when I say about disrupting higher ed, for me, it's about global connectivity and this increasing digital opportunity that we're provided. I think those are fascinating spaces we want to explore. And so when I'm spending time, it's been because, again, I get to work internationally. When I'm spending time in international institutions, I'm trying to learn that local public policy environment. I'm trying to learn what they're doing in the international and digital space particularly. That's to integrate with and build, I don't like the term build on in terms of the visual that comes with it, but to integrate with and to then enhance some of what we already have in some of the spaces that people are exploring, rather than say, okay, yeah, everything out, baby out with the bathwater, let's go.
When I ask people, what on earth is going on in general, a lot of the answers that I get are, we've become extremely market focused. That it's part of our philosophy, it's part of our culture in the Western world, that everything is based on the market. So our democracy, our government is market focused, and almost the principles of it have become market focused. And we can't think in any other paradigm anymore. And it almost goes to Francis Fukuyama's statement of the end of history after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, but which started in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that history was over because we've arrived at the ideological conclusion of humanity, which is a market-based free enterprise system of both economics, but also thought and politics. And, it's hoovered up everything, including higher education, including universities. And my fear would be that this pursuit of knowledge that you and I value clearly will be placed on the same podium as the arts. And therefore it will be, something you do in your free time. But the real pursuit of life is to make money and to maximize your utility and to make sure that you're just, you're climbing the ladder. Whereas the arts and knowledge, these two things together, are about the full human experience. They should be central and primal, whereas making money should liberate you to do those things. And it's an interesting question, because I don't want the pursuit of knowledge and therefore the university to be an antidote to the market sector, but it should be where we live more fully. And again, this making it a route to employability is a very dangerous thought, and I don't know honestly where that will go. But I wanted to ask you, Mark, where did you think that this conversation would go? Is my final question would be, I mean, if you could have this conversation with me again, or with someone else, if you're sick of me, what would you want to talk about? What's the one thing that we didn't get a chance to talk about that you'd like to?
So you know me, Ben, and I'm not going to let you throw out that statement without coming back to the Fukuyama. I think that's...
And I know you will, so go ahead.
Well, because I think we have to. So again, another big statement. I wonder, right? We're just young enough that I hope I get to live to see where I'm not sure that that's going to hold true. I think it is. I think it's, and again, you also said in the middle of that about being an anecdote or not focused on market and some language like that. Again, they're responsible institutions. They understand one of the contributions they make to the learner is to be a successful human. And right now that means being part of here in Canada, for sure, in North America, part of a successful market. That's part of the contribution they're making. But are we going to live in a globe in 30 years that is entirely market driven, and this notion of freedom and freedom of market and freedom of thought? I don't know. I think there's some other forces at play here globally that may suggest that there's a slight variation on that. And that's another why I'm intrigued by higher education, and globally especially, because I think we do, and it's easy. I get that. It's easy for us to look and go, well, yep, we got Canada, we know the US, good, we know what the UK is up to, pay a bit of attention to Australia. Hang on a second, we've got this other 3 billion people in 2 countries alone educating and going through, and let's make sure we understand where their value on higher education is, and what about some of the others that are coming on stream. So I think this deserves more exploration, and you definitely should pull some expertise to the podcast on this. Where I thought we might go, because you mentioned right at the front end, my middle name is being disruption, and and so you kind of set me up there, is that, okay, so what are we not doing well, and what should we be doing more of? How do we disrupt higher education? And again, you know the 2 areas that I'm most interested in. How do we disrupt higher ed? And what I found is we're having the conversation around what are they doing well, because I think it is important that people understand there's some incredible things happening already within the ecosystem, and now it's about exploring out and not losing some of that richness of what they are as we go into this kind of increasingly global world. And I think it's not me thinks this, it just is increasingly digital world, right? So what does that look like in the learning environment? What does that look like from an access standpoint? What does that look like from a particularly global connectivity? And importantly, based on your last statement, our assumption that there is a winner in the ideological game, that there's been a winner in the economic ideological game, there's been a winner in the political ideological, I don't think that's actually true. This isn't my area of specialty, but as a person who lives in the world, and I'm not so sure.
Doesn't work that way.
No, because a winner means we've stopped, right? The game is over. No, I don't believe that to be true. I think the game continues, and there probably never is a winner. It just means that we morph into what's next.
Well, it's like Hegel's theory of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
Yeah. And so to me, that's where in higher ed we can some of what we could experience by looking at other forces, particularly in this kind of discourse of policy and in politics and ideology, we could connect into that in a way that would be, I think, for learners quite enriching. I think it's tricky. It's hard for us to. I had this conversation not too long ago with somebody. In fact, somebody incredibly wise, and went to one of the Ivies, and we were chatting. And I said, well, what if this ideology is actually better than ours, right? And I could see the discomfort the second I said the statement. I said, the assumption is that we're trying to help the globe become closer to ours, when it might be that that's just not doable. And in fact, that's not the outcome we want. The outcome is that we want people to understand different people's ideologies and perspectives, as long as there's some basic human rights with it.
Well, it's often said that the most successful people are those who are willing to admit that they're wrong, and admit that, what I thought yesterday is actually a false assumption, and I need to generate a new one today, and that one might be false too. And in fact, it will be false, because that's the nature and the status of living in this world. Mark, thank you so much for this conversation. I remember before we had our first conversation, you told me a real gem for this podcast. You said that every episode is like visiting a foreign country. That's true, I hope, for the listener of every episode, but I think it's been true for me in this conversation. I hope it's been true. Well, this isn't a foreign country for you. This is familiar territory, but I'm really glad that we went somewhere that neither of us expected. To me, that's a goal of almost every episode, is to let's both go somewhere where we're not sure how we're going to get out of it. And I think we've set the stage for asking the other questions that you've asked right here at the end, which is, what are universities doing right, and how can we disrupt them to make sure they're doing it even better? Is that right?
Yep.
Did I say that right?
You did, except I would always take universities and slot that word out
Right.
and throw in higher education.
Higher education,
because it is an ecosystem of existing entities as well as what might be. And
there will be new entities that come in that
and I think
don't fit
that's
this
the
description.
important piece. This universities, colleges, TIs. Oh, and what else might be part of a higher education ecosystem? Right. That could be some fascinating work we could do over 10 years.
And that's exciting, too, to think about what that could be.
Yeah.
Mark, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Ben. Love having you.
To learn more about Mark Sollis, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes as well as a way to get in touch with me. Let me know what you think of this episode or any other. Let me know what you think we should do in future episodes, what guests we should have on this show. And finally, you can give the show a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use. I would really appreciate the vote of confidence. Now, your quote of the week is from Plutarch, and it goes, "The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be kindled." Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for the wonderful music, and special thanks for this episode to Mark Sollis in Calgary for giving us the space in which to record. Next week, we're talking with Conservative political staffer Stephanie Ray, who works for the Government of Ontario, about politics and the inside track of that world. I'll see you then.